and Stephen Gaines. Peter in the gray.
Nice.
And Stephen in the black over there. Nice to see you. Welcome to our show.
That's the book.
There's the book.
It's a housewarming gift for your new set.
Oh, a new set warming gift.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll put it back here. I'm still getting used to this place. I got a chair with wheels and everything. I'm so excited. Anyway, now you were involved with the Beatles for years, right?
From before the beginning until the end.
In what capacity?
Well, at the beginning, I worked in a record store. I ran a record store in Liverpool with Brian Epstein, who was the first manager. And the Beatles used to come into the store to listen to new stateside records. In those days, they couldn't afford to buy them, so they'd come in and listen to them in the store. And then later, Brian saw them and heard them in the Cavern, which is a local club, signed them to a management contract, managed to get them a record contract, and then we all moved to London, and then we started Beatlemania, and arrived the Ed Sullivan Show, Shea Stadium, the world.
Peter was, actually, Peter's being modest, he was closer to them than almost anybody else in the world. I mean, he was managing director of NIMS, their management corporation, and he was chief operating officer of Apple, that famed financial, Beatles financial kingdom where they gave away all that money and stuff. But he was also a dear friend to the Beatles and an advisor. He was best man at John and Yoko's wedding, and he introduced Paul McCartney to Linda McCartney, a day that many of the Beatles fans still rue. And he kept the Beatles' passports locked in his desk drawer so they couldn't skip town without him knowing. So he really was on the inside.
Were they hard to work with? Because I know in the book you got some stories about some of their escapades.
The escapades were it was busy, but they weren't difficult because they were friends and you could talk. I mean, we could talk and say, that's not cool, we won't do that, can we do this, and you haven't done that again, and things like that.
Now, Steve, what is your involvement in the book?
I'm a former newspaper columnist and author. I've written a lot of books on pop personalities. I wrote Marjo and Alice Cooper's biography, and I was the top of the pop columnist for the Sunday News in New York City when Peter was producing movies like Tommy and Jesus Christ Superstar, and he was producing a show called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on Broadway, and I wrote a piece about it. He introduced me to John Lennon. I got my first interview with John Lennon through Peter, and at the time I told Peter he should write a book about the Beatles, but he explained that the inner group, John, Paul, George, Ringo, Peter, Neil Aspinall, their road manager, never talked about the subject. There was a code of secrecy, like the Mafia code of secrecy, and that none of them had ever broken it. So I kept after Peter for about 5 years to go ahead and write this book and to speak to the Beatles.
To break the code.
Well, with their agreement.
It wasn't so
much. You did get there.
Oh, yeah. What happened was, I mean, by 1979, and there'd been so many projects that had come out, books, television, movies, about the Beatles, and they were all so inaccurate, so very inaccurate, and because the writers had never been able to go to the source and check their facts. So I thought the situation was becoming serious, and something definitive should be written. And I talked this over with John and Paul and George and Ringo, and I decided that I would write a book with Stephen's collaboration and with their cooperation. So once they decided to help me and to cooperate, then everyone else was released from their silence too, wives and ex-wives, and so we got it together, and we moved to England, and we did our research.
We got Peter's diaries. Peter had amazing diaries that listed the names of anybody that ever came into contact with the Beatles, and we went through those diaries and culled all the important names and literally conducted hundreds of interviews. We wanted it to be the definitive book with, of course, their enormous amount of help. Each of the Beatles contributed, many days, and in Paul McCartney's case, weeks of interviews and information. So it was exciting.
Did you have anybody in the wives of any of the Beatles, or anybody in the group that was upset about, anybody associated with the group that was upset about the book?
What kind of thing is upsetting in the book?
Well, I mean, you talk about, with Cynthia Lennon, I know where the book begins is the fact that she came home that one morning and found John and Yoko.
We all know that John and Yoko got married.
Yeah, I know that. But I mean, it was kind of a rude awakening to come home from a trip one morning and find your husband with some other lady.
But the situation is now, whereas when we decided to do the book, that the truth is better than all the myths that were going around. And it's true that sometimes when we were talking to the Beatles or the wives, these subjects were very sensitive to them, but they decided it was important for them to be told because there was so many misinformation, so many stories which have been told wrongly before, that it was necessary to get it out. And so that although it was sometimes not that difficult, not that easy to talk about it, it was necessary.
Was John the leader of the group?
Definitely.
He was the strongest
From
one?
right from the beginning to the end. I mean, there were times when he kind of withdrew, but I mean, there was no question that he was the leader.
Okay. We're going to take a little break and come back and talk more about your book, The Love You Make, Insider's Story of the Beatles. Stay with us.